Thank you for joining us in watching Netflix's latest historical drama, Munich, The Edge of War. My name is Jutta Brendemühl and I am the program curator at the Goethe-Institut Toronto. We're happy to host you tonight. Fact certainly meets fiction in director Christian Schwochow's fast-paced adaptation of Robert Harris's best-selling novel. And I hope you have questions for our participants in this Goethe Film Talk. Schwochow has always been interested in political implications in his work, and he always takes a stance. We presented his East-West German refugee drama, West, still one of my favorite contemporary German films, I have to say, at the EU Film Festival in Toronto. And on Netflix right now, you can catch Schwochow's 2020 release, Je suis Karl, in a way a sequel to Munich in that it looks at the continuing lure and the dangers of extremism. And it also features Berlinale shooting star actor Jannis Niewöhner. Niewöhner and Liv Lisa Fries, Paul and Lena in the film Munich. You'll see more of this year, and we'll tease some of our upcoming film premieres in the chat as we go along. Hitler here you might recognize as veteran actor Ulrich Mattes, who portrayed Goebbels in the film The Downfall, a TIFF premiere, by the way, as well as a priest imprisoned in Dachau in Volker Schlöndorff's The Ninth Day, also a TIFF premiere, alongside August Diehl, who also brilliantly oscillates between playing both victims and perpetrators in Malick's A Hidden Life, in Inglourious Bastards, in The Counterfeiters, and here as the ardent Nazi in Hitler's personal guard. With our guest, Piers Handling, we're about to delve into the then and now Chamberlain's diplomacy and disputed legacy, the cinematic depiction of the Munich Agreement, and that fragile moment between peace and war that unfortunately we find ourselves in again right now in Europe and many other places in the world. Now, if Piers Handling, with his vast and deep knowledge of European film, and after leading the Toronto International Film Festival for 3 decades, and of course knowing Jeremy Irons personally, and I hope he'll comment on this role, wasn't already the perfect candidate for this chat, I learned from Piers a while ago that he studied 20th century history and has a few personal stakes in this particular moment in German and British, and by extension, World and World War II history that he is willing to share with us. By the way, you heard it here first. Piers is working on a book about the Global Film Festival circuit. And I am here with booking you, Piers, for a Goethe Film Talk and book launch a little way down the road. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. Thank you for sending some in already. Join us through the YouTube chat function. Please make sure you log into that, and feel free to reach out to us at the Goethe Toronto afterwards as well. Over to film programmer and arts journalist Eric Veillette now to lead this conversation. Eric is a long-time Goethe film partner and a good friend. He ran Toronto's Revue Theatre, where we presented beautiful programs together. And Eric is steeped in European cinema, as well as current affairs, having worked for the Toronto Star newspaper and the CBC Radio-Canada. Many thanks to Piers and Eric. Looking forward to your take on the film, its context, and takeaways.
Thank you so much, Jutta, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. And many thanks, obviously, to Piers Handling for your participation tonight. How are you doing?
Oh, excellent, Eric. Was out for a long ski today. Feel great.
Down Christie Pitts, or?
No. I went up to Barrie. I do cross country, Horseshoe Valley. So I'm feeling glowy.
And I have to ask, because you stepped down as CEO of TIFF in 2018. That in everything that we've been going through for the last couple of years, that really does seem like an actual eternity ago. What have you been up to? We'd love a quick update.
Well, I think I stepped down at exactly the right moment. I chose my time. Of course, one didn't have any idea at all. I always had plans to write a book, and so I started researching it actually just before I left TIFF. So the pandemic has offered me the opportunity to just be at home. I was hoping to do a lot of traveling into archives around the world. Sadly, I have not been able to do that, but it's incredible what one can actually do at home. So I'm writing a book, as Jutta said, on the film festivals, writing a history from the very beginning to contemporary time, actually. So a global history. No one's actually ever done it, which is a huge surprise. And I think it'll probably be another 2 to 3 years before it actually appears in print. But it's been an immense amount of fun.
And obviously, the Berlinale is going to figure quite extensively in this book.
It will indeed. It will indeed. I've been going for almost 30 years to the Berlinale, and it's one of the first festivals in Europe. Not the first by any manner of means, but had such a huge role to play in the Cold War, in particular in the 50s. And then over the years, I mean, Berlin has obviously evolved into one of the key premier film events in the globe. And I always loved going, even though it was in the middle of winter, February. But it's an extraordinary city. And I had all my childhood, or my high school years, I should say, in Germany. So it was a chance for me to, go back to parts of my youth. Whenever I went to Germany, I had a lot of German friends who I continue to see and saw. So Berlin always has very special memories for me.
Now, the film that we all gathered to watch this evening, Munich, The Edge of War, directed by Christian Schwochow, it premiered on Netflix last Friday. If you're joining us this evening, you either watched it along with us just now, or you've had a chance to see it. Piers, before we jump into the film, I wanted to share 3 reviews that have been published of when the film came out, pointing out as well that as a former cinema booker for a movie theater here, I never really put too much into the Rotten Tomatoes percentages and scores, but the film has garnered an audience score of 81%, and a couple of days ago it was the 4th most watched title on Netflix Canada. So people have clearly been watching this film, talking about this film, and these 3 reviews I thought were quite pertinent and interesting. So I'll start with Manola Dargis with the New York Times, who says that for the most part, the movie comes across as a feature-length attempt to glorify Neville Chamberlain, British Prime Minister who engaged in the much-debated diplomatic strategy of appeasement in the run-up to World War II, played by a sadly juiceless Jeremy Irons in funereal mode, which is such a savage line. The Chamberlain here is a quietly heroic figure who perceptively negotiates with Hitler to avoid another war. Yet while his Chamberlain is the story's champion, a noble defender, historical bone of contention, and revisionist argument rolled into one phlegmatic figure, once again, wow. The movie's more energetic and visually engaging heroic duties have been relegated to Hugh, Paul, and the supporting players in their orbits. Frank Scheck of The Hollywood Reporter calls Ben Power's screenplay unfocused, spending too much time on the relatively uninteresting personal lives of the younger protagonists and not enough on the complex geopolitical machinations propelling the region to war. While some historians may quibble at the depiction of Chamberlain, there's no doubt that he's the film's most intriguing character, especially as superbly played by Irons, who invests his sympathetic portrayal with a world-weary dignity. And the film's strongest sequence stems not from the mortal danger that Hugh and Paul place themselves in by attempting to everything with these secret documents, but rather the tense late-night meeting in which Chamberlain brusquely rejects their concerns. And obviously, we all know how that turned out. And the final review is Jake Coyle at the Associated Press, who brings a little more today context to it that I thought was interesting. It's also an odd time to be commemorating the appeasement of fascists. The generally held legacy of the Munich Agreement is that Chamberlain was fatefully wrong when he, upon landing back in Britain after securing a pledge from Hitler, announced peace in our time to cheering throngs. The best justification for the Munich Agreement is that it brought time for Britain and others to build up their defenses for the war that would begin outright a year later. But it opened the door for Hitler's conquest. If it spent a little less time honoring Chamberlain's noble hopes and more time examining why Chamberlain, Britain, and Europe weren't more awake to the clear and present danger. I'm curious, what were your impressions of this film?
Well, I'm a history buff, so I was fascinated to see it. I was really looking forward to seeing how a filmmaker, especially a German filmmaker, would deal with this particular issue. I mean, it's one of the defining moments of 20th century history, extremely complex. And yet at the same time, of course, you're a filmmaker, so you are trying to create something that's very dramatic. You're not tied to history. You're not trying to give a lesson to people. But I probably agree with the reviewer of The Hollywood Reporter of the 3 reviews that you have put out there. I mean, I think this is a very, very ambitious film. I mean, you're setting it against real history, against the diplomatic background of extremely oh God, that month, the month of September of 1938 was full of tension. So it was one of these moments when the world had held its breath. So it was, a defining moment in European history. Yet at the same time, how do you deal with this history? How do you actually make it come alive? And the filmmaker has chosen in a way to obviously turn it into a thriller. It's almost like a spy thriller. So it has a lot of the conventions of the thriller. I mean, there's secret identities, there are messages being passed back and forth, there's documents.
There's definitely a George Smiley vibe going on throughout the film.
Exactly. So you have this kind of layered onto the real history that's going on. I mean, it's an everyman story in all kinds of ways. I mean, it reminded me of some of the way Hitchcock plots his films. The Man Who Knew Too Much, or North by Northwest. The Jimmy Stewart, or the Cary Grant character, an ordinary man who's propelled into events beyond his control, and he's trying to sort them out. In this case, you have the two young men in the film who are basically in that position. They're sort of everymen. They met at university at Oxford in the 30s. They were friends at one point in time, then they split. They're obviously, one's British, one's German, one's quite rational and removed from his emotions. He's quite detached from his wife, and the other one is very, very passionate and very committed. So you have these two young men who are trying to negotiate this world. And then set on top of them, of course, are two historic personages, two of the, certainly one of the most famous people in the entire 20th century, Hitler, and trying as a German filmmaker to cope and portray this on screen. Him on screen must have been a huge challenge. I mean, this is one of those figures. What do you actually do with him? And the same with Chamberlain. I mean, Chamberlain is nowhere near as well known. Churchill has actually overwhelmed him. But I always thought that Chamberlain got a tough knock from history. So about 2-3 years ago, I actually searched out a biography, and there's very little material written on Chamberlain, just to go a little bit deeper into who and what he was. And I mean, I think sadly he was dealt, as Jeremy Irons, I think one of the lines in the film is, he's dealt a poor hand, and that's the hand that he had to deal with. It was a moment in time when nobody in the world really wanted to go to war at all. And Chamberlain was, he was caught in that at that point in time. He was not a Churchill figure at all. He was looking for peace, as everyone was. Unfortunately, he was dealing with somebody who had no time for the niceties of diplomacy, and had a very different agenda to basically set out and conquer living room for Germany. So you have this kind of old and the two old men and the two young men. And the two old men represent power. They have power. The two young men are there to try and see if they can insert themselves into the situation and actually change it. So it's an interesting hypothesis, especially because at this particular point in time, there was a German resistance that a lot of people don't really know about. It wasn't particularly strong. There were very few people. But what is alluded to in the film, the army in particular led this, but there was a resistance, and it did coalesce around Munich. They thought that Hitler was going too far with the Czech situation, and they really did not want to go to war, in particular with France and with England. So there was this resistance. So the German figure does actually represent something that's real and true in the film. And then you have this other young German who's part of the Hitler's personal bodyguard, who is in a kind of way a reflection of a different side of the older Paul, fanatic in his own kind of way, and Paul has reformed himself. And then layered on top of this are 4 women. So you've got 5 men and 4 women. 9 characters is a lot to have in a film, a 2-hour film, and to actually keep them all together in balance in the film, I think is very, very difficult to do. And of course, the women, you have a traditional wife who's talking about her husband, wanting her husband to stay at home and respect her family life, et cetera, et cetera. You have a girlfriend who, as we discover in the course of the film, is Jewish, and she's essentially, incapable and immobilized by the end of the film. You have an older woman who's married to a German general who's somewhat involved in the resistance. And then you have one of the characters who I thought was incredibly underdeveloped is this British typist, who's obviously, I guess, an Indian. And she's there for plot purposes, and sadly only for plot purposes. So with 9 characters, 9 major characters in the film, 2 of who are real historic people, it's a lot that gets crowded in to a plot that the filmmaker tries to keep moving forward in terms of not quite a whodunit, but it's close to that. It's like, what would have happened if this had, if something had shifted, if something had changed, if we had actually assassinated Hitler. So it has that kind of whodunit quality to it. For me, it was, so you sort of pick the film apart and you look at it and you analyze, the Chamberlain figure, who's obviously the pragmatist, and Hitler, who is absolutely like a realist, a real politic man who has his own agenda. And you have the appeaser, you have the warmonger. And then amongst the younger kids, you have the younger characters in the film, you have 2 characters who are almost, warring with each other. One's British, one's German. One has a very different personality from the other. One obviously has a sense of urgency because he's trying to save his country. And the Brit is caught in the middle, but he does want to help his friend. So the film, I felt, was just this kind of a stew of too much going on. I mean, you and I talked earlier about the film, and you said it should be a mini series. I'm not even sure in a mini series if this would actually have worked out. It's very, very difficult to do a film of this nature set against, I think, a real historic backdrop. And Munich itself, the conference, and the 2 conferences that preceded it that month, there was so much going on there that makes such fascinating history. And you see some of the personages, some of the characters in the background, but they actually don't speak. I mean, Mussolini and Göring had a huge role to play in what actually materialized in Munich, but neither of them are actually given speaking parts.
I think no, I don't think Mussolini utters a word. I think he's very much all chin, just in that the one or two. He
actually looked great. He looked like a real Mussolini, unlike Hitler. I mean, we can come to the characters in the film, and maybe before I do that, the film itself left me, because you're moving through so many characters so quickly, it left me so cold and so detached, because I don't think you go deep into any of those particular moments. There's a few moments where the filmmaker slows the film down and you're into conversations. And those conversations are between the young man and the older man. And they're perhaps the most effective parts of the film, although I think when I reflect on them, they didn't go deep enough for me. They were somehow, the film itself suffers from a certain type of cliched situation, cliched encounters, cliched moments, where as a cinephile, somebody who's, loves film, you just want to go a little bit deeper. You want the filmmaker to probe. You want to be challenged in a certain kind of way. You want a certain insight into who and what people are. I think you get a little bit of that with Chamberlain. I think the scenes that were mentioned in the review, the scene where the two young men sit down with Chamberlain late at night, and Chamberlain gives the young German 3 minutes of time. I think it's probably more on the screen, and then basically gives him a lecture in terms of pragmatism, and just dismisses him. I mean, that's one of the key moments in the film, again, that I felt really didn't go that deep, although I thought it was well acted and well played. And of course, the other moments are the moments between the young German and Hitler. And I thought these were probably, I don't know whether it's so difficult to see Hitler portrayed on screen, on film, but I don't think this actor caught who and what Hitler was. I mean, I remember Bruno Ganz in Downfall, such an extraordinary performance, but of course that was a broken man at the end of his life, just before he was about to die. Hitler in 1938 was at the peak of his power and energy. I mean, he was incredibly charismatic. He'd given this extraordinary speech a few weeks before Munich in the Sportspalast, where people went absolutely crazy. And of course, we've seen speeches that have been filmed of Hitler, and you get that sense of the sheer energy and dynamism of the man. When you've read books by Albert Speer, his munitions minister, Speer talks about the hypnotism that Hitler had over other people, and that of course failed to come through with this actor. I mean, I think he did a superb job playing Goebbels in Downfall, but this is a very, very tough role to play.
There was almost a sense of him almost swimming in his costume, in his uniform in the film as well, whereas all the other characters seem to be maybe a little more, their suits were a little more sort of fitted.
I think you're right. I mean, I just watched some documentary footage of Hitler and Goering in 1940 in France, and Hitler has this erect power. I mean, he feels who he is as a person, and of course, he's in a very tight-fitting uniform. He's a person who fills out that uniform, even though he wasn't a particularly tall or impressive man. I mean, he was so underestimated. Chamberlain, when he came back from, I think, the first conference in Berchtesgaden, talked about him as a small little man, somebody that we don't really, in a funny way, need to be that afraid of. And I think Chamberlain's completely underestimated Hitler, and probably is an upper English class Brit who had a sense of what power looked like and felt like. Hitler didn't fit that at all. He was a corporal in the German army in the First World War. And he looked like a corporal. He didn't look like a Hindenburg, or he didn't look like a Prussian general. I mean, he very much looked like a thug in the way that Mussolini did as well. This was a new generation of politicians coming up, ruthless politicians who had a world agenda or an agenda for power that the 19th century effete British politician couldn't quite come to grips with. And I think this was, Chamberlain's great failing. But so those moments in the film, and I think, let's talk about it as a film, where you're looking for that electricity. And, I'll go back to Hitchcock. When you think of the set pieces, the great set pieces in some of his work, especially the two films I've mentioned, these are, films that revolve around these set pieces. They build towards them. Filmically, it's what you take away. The Mount Rushmore sequence or the crop dusting sequence in North by Northwest. There's nothing really like that in this film. It doesn't kind of build. And these two moments, or these, I guess there's actually probably three moments, because there's two single meetings between young Paul and Hitler, lack that gravitas, lack that sense of electricity that kind of you want to have crackle off the screen. I mean, I'm interested in Manola's comment about Jeremy as Chamberlain. I think that's probably, Chamberlain was not a strong man. He was,
and they don't hide his health problems at that point in his life either in the movie.
He was an old man. Mm-hmm. I mean, he flew his trips. I mean, he practiced shuttle diplomacy, 3 trips to Berchtesgaden, Bad Godesberg, and in Munich, all in the course of a month. It was the first time he had been in a plane. So he was either 69, 70, around that age, 70, 71. He was towards the end of his life because he died shortly thereafter. But he was, so I think Irons, Jeremy captures that. He certainly captures the British upper class dignity of the person, and he captures that sense of it's a kind of charm. I mean, it's a relaxed charm. It's I know how to deal with the world. I'm comfortable in my skin. I control the environment I'm in, and I think Jeremy does that extremely well. And I think the scenes that as a German filmmaker, I think the scenes that play with he and the young Hugh Leggett are, they're scenes that rang true to me because I came from an English family as well. And you sense that, you see that the older person mentoring the younger person, and just that, they were both at Oxford, so they have that kind of connection. And this, the scenes between Paul and Hitler, probably, I mean, it's interesting. Hitler sees Paul immediately as an Oxford grad, somebody who's got an education who he distrusts immediately. So,
when he challenges him on the train.
Exactly. So you kind of, you sense that class thing immediately in Germany, which I think Hitler obviously felt and was forced to feel through his entire career. But as a film, it failed so much. And the secondary characters, always look towards, secondary characters. I think they illuminate so much of what, sub-themes, ideas that a filmmaker perhaps he doesn't want his central characters to deal with. And I felt those sub-characters all of the women in particular, because none of them really have agency. I mean, they're all secondary characters, as sadly, a crisis like Munich revealed at that point in time. There were no women in the room; it was all men, deciding the fate of the world. But the women are underdeveloped as characters. I mean, it's a male film, and the four main characters are all men. I mean, the women are just there supporting roles. So I was sad that they were just not more explored as characters in the film, and more nuanced, and just reflected a little bit something different that was going on in the world.
Especially when you've got some talent like Sandra Hüller.
Exactly.
But Paul's wife, especially in that scene in the restaurant at their anniversary, him essentially saying, we could be off to war, and there's no emotional reaction whatsoever to it, was kind of off-putting in my reading.
I mean, I agree, and she just turns into a sort of a whiny wife, sadly. Family versus duty, and please don't go away to Munich, and you've got a child here, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure all that is, was very true in terms of what was actually going on, but there were obviously other different ways of portraying that kind of tension, and I didn't feel in any significant way in the hands of a filmmaker who was really in control of the mood, the tone, the characters, the situations. Not that the film failed in all levels, but it just never elevated itself out of what I would call, an ordinary run-of-the-mill television drama.
I think we both walked into this movie also expecting maybe a little more sort of table diplomacy, which doesn't really take place. The actual conference itself takes place behind closed doors. So I mean, I kind of walked into this expecting more of that. That's what I wanted to see. And of course, this revisionism that we're seeing at the end. And I don't know if you would go as far as to call it that with Chamberlain's portrayal.
Well, the title cards at the end really bothered me for two reasons. One, just the inaccuracy of the first one. Chamberlain, I mean, the title card gives you a sense that the Munich agreement and the negotiations crushed Chamberlain, and he died soon after. Well, that's not the story at all. I mean, Chamberlain was the British Prime Minister until May 1940, the invasion of France. Basically another year and a half after Munich. He died in November 1940, after Churchill took over as the premier, but he had a long period in power, a good 18 to almost 2 years after Munich. So he didn't fade away, far from it. So that part of that title card, I thought, was highly inaccurate, because Chamberlain held on to power, and then it's followed by the title card that follows, which is about how this year of peace allowed the British to rearm. Well, it did, but of course it allowed the Germans to continue to arm. So it wasn't just the Germans stopped rearming and it gave the British an extra year. Far from it. In fact, there was not a huge sense of urgency after Munich on Chamberlain's part. He was not fully convinced. He actually thought that he had a peace agreement. He thought that he had actually had Hitler on side. In letters that he was writing to his sisters, reports to cabinet, he thought that he had the measure of Hitler. And even in July 1939, about 6 weeks before they went to war, he was still fully convinced that Hitler was not going to go down this path. I mean, even though what's not gone into in the film is the fact that the Czech breakup happened in 2 stages. It happened in the Sudetenland was taken away from Czechoslovakia in the September Munich agreement, but in March 1939, about 6-7 months later, Hitler invaded, took over the rest of the country. Mm-hmm. And that was a defining moment, I think, for the anti-appeasers in England. Churchill was in the process of being deselecting by his constituents as a parliamentarian. He would have lost his position within the Conservative power. I mean, he was perceived in the Conservative Party. He was perceived as a warmonger by many. Chamberlain went out of his way in the House of Commons to diminish him and demean him. So Yeah, I mean, Chamberlain has always fascinated me because he was in some ways the wrong person at the wrong time. He found himself, beyond his capabilities, out of his depth, and dealing with somebody who was probably one incapable of dealing with a Hitler. But you needed the pugnacious Churchill to come along and to put the house in order.
And as Yuta mentioned in her introduction earlier, you have a family connection to Berlin in the 1930s as well that you wanted to share with us.
Well, yeah, my mom was born in London, so and they were traveling on the continent, and she was in with her family in Austria and Germany in 1938, I think it was. So around the time that all this was going on. And I remember some of the stories she told me about, just seeing the flags, just seeing that sense of, a renewed, whatever, energetic Germany. And, how disturbing that was. She was about 18, 19.
Mm-hmm.
So, at this point in time, her father was in the RAF, quite senior. So he would have been very, very aware of rearmament, those issues that were going on I mean, he fought in the First World War. And as a young 19-year-old girl, this backdrop of extreme stress. I mean, it's exactly what people in the Ukraine are going through now. It's unimaginable for us to imagine actually what those people are going through. They don't know if tomorrow or the day after they're going to be at war. Their friends are going to be shot. They're going to be shot. Their houses are going to be bombed. They have no idea at all. So I think that was the atmosphere in which my mother and her family were in Germany at this point in time, seeing this extraordinary outpouring of national pride.
And I think, as you just mentioned, the current situation between Russia and the Ukraine at all. I mean, taking Yuta's words here, can you appease a megalomaniac?
Well, I think, of course, what the film shows is that the way to deal with bullies is you have to push back very quickly, very early. And Chamberlain inherited a situation where perhaps if the French and the British had pushed back in 1936 when Germany reoccupied the Rhineland, that would have actually deterred Hitler. But because they didn't, they simply stood aside, allowed Hitler and Germany to reoccupy the Rhineland. That moment had passed, and then Hitler, that emboldened Hitler, and then he took over Austria, Czechoslovakia, and then of course it was Poland. So I think the lesson that history has for us is that when you're dealing with dictators, with people who are pushing their power around, one needs to stand up to them very early in life, because otherwise, when it gets too late, it becomes very messy.
And it's along those lines as well. I mean, earlier this week, dealing with the anti-Semitism situation, there was a school board in Tennessee that actually voted to ban Art Spiegelman's Maus graphic novel, the Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel, from all of its schools, citing reasons of coarse language and some nudity content in the book. And obviously, anybody who has read this book, which is a very, very personal account of a family going through the Holocaust, you realize that this is beyond thinly veiled anti-Semitism. So we've got these two situations this week alone that are very clearly reflective of the situations that we're seeing in this film.
Pointing that out, one of the things that's not dealt with in the title cards either is it was only a matter of days, a week or a week and a half after the Munich Agreement, that Kristallnacht happened in Germany. So for somebody like Chamberlain to have returned to England, piece of in our time, et cetera, waving that piece of paper, to see what had gone on in Germany with Kristallnacht must have been, or should have been, a huge wake-up call to the so-called civilized world, that something was going on in Germany that was not going to be stopped. It was not going to be stopped by Chamberlain. It was not going to be stopped by normal channels of diplomacy. It was going to be stopped only by sheer force. And the fact that the Western powers didn't really wake up to this moment perhaps says something about an inbuilt anti-Semitism in these powers, in these countries at that particular point in time anyway, France and England. But it was, there were no surprises, I guess, when it came to Hitler. I mean, he displayed his naked aggression internally as well as externally at this point in time. So no matter if I feel that Chamberlain was a compromised individual when it came to history, at the same time, I think he was completely out of his depth and just totally misread the situation.
We did. We received an audience question about just staying on topic with the film's current relevance and its impact. And the question is: can political films affect change of opinion in audiences, or entice them to rethink the world around them? And perhaps you've witnessed this with a film that you've presented at TIFF over the years.
You'd like to think that. I mean, that's one of the reasons I got involved in cinema. So we've shown things like Hotel Rwanda, which dealt with the situation in Rwanda and Africa. To give people you hope that this gives people a greater sense of what's going on in the world. And I've just seen Don't Look Up, on Netflix a couple of weeks ago, and it's the same. I mean, it's a kind of a funny metaphor for climate change, the climate crisis, this comet, this asteroid that's about to hit the Earth, and nobody pays attention to it until it's too late. What can film do at the end of the day? Well, film creates awareness. Often it only creates awareness amongst the people that are previously aware anyway, or are curious and want to become better educated about certain situations. So, I mean, I still remain an optimist in terms of what film can communicate to people as information and turn them into better informed citizens. But in terms of actually changing people's lives, I mean, Inconvenient Truth, has that changed the way? Perhaps it certainly moved the agenda forward when it came to climate change in certain ways. So, Michael Moore's films, which are, a kind of pamphleteering, modern pamphleteering. I think Michael's, done a certain amount to change certain people. So it still has, some power, but I don't think it fundamentally ever changes what people believe. I think that's very, very difficult to shift, especially nowadays when things are so polarized and there's so much social media happening. I mean, years ago, when I started in film, film, I think in a way, maybe in the 60s, we held out the possibility of it changing the world, but there's so little media around us in that point in time. I mean, there was television, but there wasn't the multi-channel universe, and there certainly wasn't social media. So I think just the overwhelming barrage of information right now, and film is just a part of that information barrage. There's so much of it. You look for people, and you look for information that supports your ideas to a certain extent. I mean, I don't think many of us search out the material that we absolutely and totally don't agree with, although I'm sure there are some people who should be doing this, but I mean, I don't do that. I should be doing it, but we look to things where our opinions and our ideas are being reinforced.
And on the topic of films about World War II, films about these big decisions that had serious impact on the 20th century, what would you want to see from future movies on this particular period? Like, what has not been explored so far?
I think for me, history films should speak to the present. I think films that are set in the past, that idealize the past or deal with the past, are in a curious way kind of irrelevant. And because I do love historical films and historical filmmaking, and love to see what filmmakers do with recreating an era and a time. But I want something there to be relevant about what's going on in today's world. So obviously, in terms of the populist leaders, the populist autocrats who have grown up in the last 10 years or so around the world, the right-wing autocrats and populists, this is a very, very dangerous moment, I think, in the history of the world. And the 30s and the 40s, who of course were a moment when this really emerged in a significant way with Hitler and Mussolini in particular. So a historical film for me needs to make a connection somehow to the present, to the here and now. So I think that any films that dealt with both Hitler and Mussolini, or those populist autocrats, the subject matter would focus on that power, the relationship between an Albert Speer and a Hitler, an extremely intelligent, articulate man who one would have thought would never have been persuaded and hypnotized by somebody like Hitler, but he clearly was for years and years. and then came to recant. So what's going on there? Will we ever fully understand? So what kind of filmmaker can, probe that particular charisma that people like Mussolini and Hitler had? And obviously, the populists, autocrats right now have a certain charisma. Some of them do. I'm not sure that Putin does. But people like Donald Trump, obviously a charismatic figure in the eyes of many people. So what do you do? And the President Bolsonaro in Brazil, what do you do with these populists? How do you neutralize them, or how do you engage with them? And so for me, a historical film that grapples with the Second World War, that comes to grips with some of these issues, are probably the kind of film I'd like to see.
Well, I think we've come to the end of this chat. I really wanted to thank you for your participation and just sharing, especially the family connections with the 30s in Germany, and I look forward to more chats like this on the Goethe channels.
It went by so quickly, Eric.
It really did. I was a little worried about filling this hour, but
it's
no.
Funny. There's a moment in the film we haven't talked about, and I think we maybe got a minute or two. I'm not sure if Yutta's going to sign off, but I'll just point people towards the watch and the watch scenes. And I've tried to make sense of those. And because he comes back and returns to the watch. And for me, a filmmaker that accentuates something, you want to really know what's going on in this moment. Like, what does the watch mean? What does this particular moment mean? And I'm still a little mystified as to what's going on there. I have an idea and a thought, but that again is just one of the loose ends of this film that I wanted the filmmaker to examine in a deeper level.
One of the moments that struck out to me was the toothbrush scene on the sidewalks, because there's actual film footage of that happening, and that's also one of the things that Chaplin shows in The Great Dictator, and is one of these very absurdly evil moments that he doesn't need to draw out. He doesn't need to exaggerate the situation whatsoever. You just see it on the sidewalks, very much in the same way that you're seeing in that film, and I thought that was a very interesting callback.
I agree. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, and look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thanks, Eric.